We are currently seeing unprecedented migration from troubled states in Africa and the Middle East on Europe's southern flank. It is a tide of humanity desperately seeking a better life. We must, of course, do what we can to help those in danger of losing their lives at sea, and we are. Britain will always meet its obligations to provide refuge for the most vulnerable. We already participate in the UN's program to resettle refugees who fled from their home countries, including those affected by conflict and civil war. And we also set up our own scheme for vulnerable people fleeing the conflict in Syria, including women and children at risk who couldn't be protected in the region. And today I can announce that we'll work with the United Nations to modestly expand this national scheme so that we provide resettlement to the most vulnerable fleeing Syria, those who cannot be adequately protected in neighboring countries. But we won't resolve this crisis unless we do more to stop these people leaving their countries in the first place, until we break the link between boarding a boat and settling in Europe. This is where we need to work together as European nations to tackle the root of the problem, not merely to alleviate its symptoms. Again, clear thinking is needed. All the evidence shows that the most important factor in someone's decision to make this journey is how they'll be treated in terms of being allowed to stay in Europe. So schemes of relocation don't solve this problem. What works is what the Spanish did when migrants arrived in their thousands in the Canary Islands. They worked with the countries people were coming from and traveling through. They made sure they had the right police, coast guard, aid and governance resources to stop people taking the decision to leave. And they made sure that the economic migrants who did end up leaving were returned safely. We need to do the same on a larger scale. We should be leading the world on promoting development and helping our international partners build stronger institutions. Now, despite difficult economic times, Britain has kept its commitment to spend 0.7% of our GDP on overseas aid. It is the right thing to do to build prosperity for the world's poorest, and it's the right thing to do to help stabilize and secure countries in the long run, protecting our security here in Europe. So from Eastern Europe to the Middle East, these security threats, they often have one thing in common: a failure of governance in other countries. It is the failure of governance in African states that leads many to want to leave. It is in part the failure of Libyan governance, which has allowed the traffickers to profit from human misery. It was the failure of Ukrainian governance in the years before 2014, which led to discontent and instability. It's the failure of governance in the Middle East, which has left a vacuum within which ISIL can proliferate. The fear of the family in eastern Ukraine, listening to the Russian shells get closer and closer to their home, and the desperation of the family in Eritrea, willing to risk everything in order to reach the edge of Europe. All this human tragedy comes back to a failure of governance in these countries. So let us now show that we can deal with this. Let us show that we understand the primacy of economic security and political stability, that we are clear about these threats, we are uncompromising in our response, and we are confident of our ability to address failed states. Because if we do all those things, and I have no doubt that we can, we will be able to deal with these threats, and we will successfully protect the security of all our nations.
About the new plan for resettling vulnerable Syrian refugees out of neighboring countries. Can you provide us some more details about this? And specifically looking on the larger picture in Syria, not only on the ISIL aspect, but the broader conflict in Syria. What is your position and any kind of announcement that you can make today? Thank you.
Okay. First of all, on what Britain and other countries can do to resettle vulnerable families, this is only ever going to be a very small part of what needs to be done. What we have done in the past is measured in the hundreds of families that are particularly vulnerable, that can't be looked after in the region. As I'm saying today, we think that that can be modestly expanded. But let's be frank about it. The situation with millions of refugees and displaced people inside Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and elsewhere, this needs a massive humanitarian aid effort of money going into the region. And Britain is the second largest bilateral aid donor to make sure those people can have the shelter and the food and the protection that they need. But the long-term answer cannot be for people to live in camps year after year. It's got to be to go back to the countries they came from, which leads to your second question, which is what is the route to a more secure Middle East, particularly in Syria and Iraq? Well, we could spend all day on that, but I would just say, in a sentence, both countries need the same thing, which is a government that can represent all of their people. It is this failure of governance that I talk about that it's the heart of the problem. Why did ISIL take hold in Syria and then Iraq? Well, because Bashar Assad was one of the greatest drivers to ISIL because of the butchery of his own people. Why did ISIL succeed in taking hold in Iraq? Because Maliki was not a prime minister for all of the Iraqi people, Sunni, Shia, and Kurd. So while it will be a very complicated and difficult path to have a new Iraq and a new Syria, the end goal is simple. You need a government that can represent all of the people. Then you're more likely to have the peace and stability required and people can return. Until then, Britain will continue to fulfill its humanitarian and moral obligations by being one of the biggest aid donors to the region and making sure people are given a place of safety.